Thank you everybody for coming here. My name is Camilo Benitez. I'm a postdoc researcher here at the section of Ethics, Philosophy of Technology at TPM, TU Delft. I'm a part of a larger group of researchers, also students, which are interested in how to understand, engineer, and design from decolonizing lenses. So this is one of the multiple, let's say, activities that we're engaging. And in this time, in association with the Student Generale, that has been, let's say, the entity here at the university that actually brought this topic. And now we are very happy that we can collaborate together. So today we will have two speakers. The first one is Raki Ap, which is here. Raki will give us, let's say, a deep understanding of what is coloniality in the real world, specifically talking about the history of West Papua and how that's linked to climate anti-racist activism that he is leading here in the Netherlands. So he will talk us about human rights and environmental issues in West Papua, bringing an understanding how, let's say, that connects to the previous colonization time from the Netherlands and then now under Indonesian rule. And then we will invite Anne-Linn. Sorry, my pronunciation of Dutch is very poor still. So what is very interesting is that Anne-Linn is one of our recent graduates of industrial ecology, and she will, let's say, share her experience how to perform, let's say, research using decolonizing lenses. Then we will have a breaking groups in order to reflect on how you, on your practice as a professional researcher or educator or a student, can introduce these lenses. So we have a lot of things for doing, so I will just give the floor to Raki.
So, yeah, thank you so much.
I think you don't need this.
I think, yeah. So thank you so much, Camilo, and also Klaas, for inviting me to be here and shine a light from my personal life and that perspective of the people of West Papua and in general the indigenous peoples regarding the topic for today, which I think is very important and relevant, especially for those who are involved in the energy transition. So I'm gonna take you immediately on the journey towards my life, where it started, and 60 years back to a former colony of the Netherlands, for you to understand the different layers what brought us in this climate crisis and climate and biodiversity crisis from the so-called indigenous perspectives on climate change. I'm gonna use these topics to share the layers that I describe as the power structures, which I will jump into the brief colonial history of West Papua and the Netherlands, the transfer from the Netherlands to Indonesia, West Papua, I mean with that, the multinational mining corporations in West Papua, and how that is related to the ecological crisis there and humanitarian crisis, and how this all together makes West Papua a clear topic of how the situation there is very much related and connected to the climate and biodiversity crisis. Before I start with the first slide after this, I'm just curious, who of you have heard about West Papua before you have read anything about my activism? Can I see hands? Okay, look around you. Who of you is Dutch citizen? Okay, a little bit less than half, right? Keep this just in mind for a later stage in my presentation. So a little bit about me. On the picture right, you can see some pictures of me where after I was a political refugee, I fled West Papua after the Indonesian military assassinated my father 4 months before I was born. At the year of 1, I arrived in the Netherlands. I joined the army, the Air Force, because I thought that was the best way to participate to peace and justice. However, I understand that behind this institution there are political dynamics which I, don't support in a certain way, and that transformed me to the R1 activist I became today, becoming also the international spokesperson of the Free West Papua campaign. educating people about West Papua and why it is so important, especially for people who care and want to fight against the climate crisis, to understand what is happening there. So here a picture. West Papua is the western half of the island of New Guinea, right above Australia. Culturally and ethnically, we clearly belong to all the other archipelagos in the Pacific region. And together, this is the world's largest tropical island. So what happened? Just a brief timeline. As a former military servant, these two pictures really underline the historical bond that West Papua and the Netherlands share. How this chapter has been wiped out, left out of the Dutch history curriculum in the history books. Even teachers were overwhelmed when I give this presentation. As you can see, the flag at the submarine is the West Papua Morning Star flag. And also on the tails of the Dutch airplanes, flying above Biak, which is the island my parents come from, at the period that the Netherlands still colonized this territory. So what happened? In this timeline, I have outlined the most important dates. From 1900 to the independence of Indonesia, 1949, West Papua was part of the former Dutch East Indies, the Indonesia we know today. After Indonesian independence, West Papua basically was prepared by the Netherlands under the new name, the Netherlands New Guinea, towards independence. In 1961, in the picture right, you see Queen Juliana, former Queen Juliana, with the New Guinea Council, the first administration, and left the handover and installation of the West Papua Morning Star flag, which you saw before, all in preparation towards that independence. But it didn't happen, because a year later, 1962, under huge international pressure, led by the Americans, West Papua was forced to hand over to the Indonesia we know today. So they didn't participate during the transfer, and we went from another colonizer, from a former colonizer to a new one, Indonesia. And then we end up in this year, 2022. And these are the pictures that when you Google, you will find about human rights violations in West Papua. It can get worse. Lynching West Papuans, you can find them on YouTube. Slavery kind of situations, and the reports aren't lying. This is a report of Amnesty International by 2018. Don't bother, just let them die, killing with impunity in West Papua. So the title says basically everything. Reports of neglected genocide, and if you will go deeper, you will find into more human rights violations. So the connection, historical context, is the first layer. Mining corporation, as I mentioned before, is the world's largest gold mine, second largest copper mine, owned by US/Australian company, and it's the largest taxpayer to the Indonesian government. This is just one element. Of course, we've got more corporations there, such as BP, with one of its largest LNG gas projects, which is very relevant in this time of an energy crisis. West Papuans lived there for thousands of years, and they have to fled the land, forced, and if they didn't work, collaborate, they were assassinated or killed. In the recent years, more palm oil companies came in, once again destroying immense lands of indigenous peoples who live there in peace and make, palm oil for all the products we need here. So the second layer, multinationals, corporations in West Papua, deforestation and human rights violations fall all together there. So this is the reality of indigenous West Papuans living in their own land. The militarization of West Papua is one of the highest if you compare citizens versus military personnel. And if you compare this to the current exposure in what is happening in east of Europe, Ukraine, I think everybody's known what is happening there, 24/7 news coverage, but almost no news about the genocide, colonialism, on what is happening in Dutch former New Guinea. So that's where our campaign came in, to educate people about what is happening in West Papua. An article, right, from Wageningen University, the #1 green hub, if you look at the educations that they deliver on ecosystem restoration, biodiversity. And this was a course that they're giving. I give a guest lecture there last year, and next week one more regarding environmental justice in practice. How does it look like? And the general line in my story is this. Outlined by the UN, 5% of world's population consists of indigenous peoples, and their way of life have preserved more than 80% of world's remaining biodiversity. That's a big number, 80%. 96% of all deforestations happens on the same indigenous lands, conform a report of the Green Left Party, the Netherlands, due to mining, soya, palm oil, fossil fuel activities, as you saw in West Papua. So indigenous peoples preserve 80% of what's remaining biodiversity, it's their land, and 96% of the water deforestation happens on the same lands. If you put those two numbers besides each other, the most obvious, clear, and just climate transition or solution occur. Protect their lives and rights. And that's where this perspective is all about. If you zoom into New Guinea Island, where I came from, it's the world's largest tropical island with one of the most unique land and marine biodiversity hotspots in the world, you should expect, well, environmental organizations would focus what is happening there. But my presentation and guest lecture at Wageningen University overwhelmed the student and the lecture, including Greenpeace Netherlands and other environmental organizations. So what is going wrong, you would expect? You should be aware about what is happening there. So we wrote a critical article and these institutions were overwhelmed. I said, if that article is overwhelming you, well, explain me why we are making campaigns about the extinction of the orang-utang while 500,000 Indonesian West Papuans have been assassinated, 1/3 of a population. It's one of the most militarized zones in the world. NGOs and media are still banned up to today. And while all these corporations are allowed to do what they do best, destroy environment and kill people. So this was one critical article explained towards the Greenpeace Netherlands and other environmental organizations that they should reflect on, and they were a little bit shocked. We can't find it in this critical article. So, right, you should explain it. Why are animals more worth than human lives in Indonesia? Because, as the science is saying of the UNFCCC, if we have protected and campaigned for the lives and rights of indigenous peoples, these plants and animals were still there. It's that simple. Because they care about the environment. That's why they have 80% of what's remaining biodiversity. And luckily, it is now underlined by the UN, DESA and this Department of Economic and Social Affairs, saying ensuring the collective rights of indigenous people to lands and territories and resources not only for their well-being, but also for addressing some of the most pressing global challenges. So this is basically a crucial perspective and knowledge that every green organization should know. So this is what I asked them to reflect on. From the 3.6 billion years of life that Earth exists to less than 10 years to prevent irreversible destruction of Earth's ecosystem. What does innovation and development means? This is something to reflect on. And this was a Rio to COP, the last climate summit in Glasgow, where they invited me to talk about a sustainable travel for all. Sustainable travel for all. And this is what I mentioned to them. In the context of climate justice, yes, of course I support more trains, more windmills. But where are these minerals are coming from? Not from Amsterdam, not from London or New York. Once again, from areas like West Papua, and we are already delivering a lot of gold and copper for our consuming behavior. And now we need more resources. Who's going to pay the price for that once again? So there can't be a just transition without degrowth, without an equal rights, without environmental justice, human justice. This is what we have delivered at COP26. You can Google it for yourself, greenstatevision.info, where you can see an indigenous-led solution regarding the climate and biodiversity crisis. And we got some coverage there. I also stand on stage with the great Greta Thunberg on a protest in Glasgow. I think more than 100,000, 500,000 people participated, 50,000 to 100,000, I should say, and where the climate justice narrative has been welcomed. Just a highlight about how institutions play a role. If you can translate it, without Dutch East India, Dutch former colony Indonesia, there was no technical university Delft. This is what an article of a former professor here, if I think. So the connection between institutions and colonization isn't something weird. They were there sometimes to deliver that what governments wanted from them. So nowadays, luckily, more institutions like museums, but also universities are welcoming this perspective, and it is needed for them to understand the structures that we have created this world with knowledge or media or politics, decision-making. It is all interconnected. And you can see it all back to West Papua, how it's been left out of the history books, of the media, as you can see 24/7 news coverage. And the connection between what is happening there, colonization, capitalism, racism, because our lives are not worth like those of in Ukraine. These perspectives have been left out of institutions. We have built this world, the thinking with the knowledge we share. And there's a lot of beautiful in there, but a lot of gaps as well. And that's why it is important that the story is coming together. I'm closing with the momentum that we have built by just storytelling, educating people. The example of West Papua, it's not new, but it's just a showcase that about perspective that we should know and we should care. And we've created a lot of momentum in the world. I just came back from COP27 from New York because the story is finally being heard. When you talk about climate justice, you cannot say, you know, it's not about colonization, it's about capitalism. We are talking about solutions, right? No, it's not. That's the biggest mistake you can make. And that's why we're traveling to make people and stakeholders understand about the perspective that they should know when they make decisions. So, yeah, COP27, as you can see, a parliamentary hearing last week about West Papua. So momentum is building, but the momentum is there because individuals are finding the courage to be an ally, stand up and speak. And that's why we are here. And from here, I wanted to give up to, over to Anne-Linn. Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Raki, for giving me the floor. My name is Anne-Linn Machielsen, and the coming 50 minutes, I'm going to tell you about my experience of how to do decolonial research at the TU Delft. Yeah, so this summer I graduated on the Master's Industrial Ecology, and I did research for my master thesis. I did research on green colonialism, where I did research on the colonial injustice related to nickel mining in West Papua. But before I'm going to dive into that, first let me say something more about myself. As you can see, I'm white, I'm a woman, I'm 26 years old. I grew up and lived my whole life in the Netherlands. I have a Dutch passport. I'm educated on academic universities, and the way I see things and how I experience things is also situated by my position. And but I always try to strive for injustices, and I always cared for our planet, and I try to address inequalities. So that's also why I choose to study the Master Industrial Ecology, because I felt like climate change is our biggest threats we have as humans. And I wanted to learn more about how I can contribute to solutions for sustainable development, and especially about one of our biggest challenges, the energy transition. But I was a little bit lost during my master's because I felt that there was quite a Western perspective on those technical solutions. And I was a little bit missing quite an important perspectives, but I didn't know which perspectives. But then the Black Lives Matter came, and I became more and more aware about my white privilege and about the blind spots I have. But I didn't know that at the time there was also the Papuan Lives Matter, because as a Dutch citizen, I didn't know that West Papua even exists, and I didn't know about the shared history between the Netherlands and West Papua. But luckily, that week, I read a book, Now It's Still Possible, from Extinction Rebellion, and Raki shared in just 5 pages his personal story, and with the case of West Papua, how colonialism and capitalism and climate change is connected. And also, luckily, that week I also saw Raki when I was working in the Café Utopie. And 2 weeks later, we organized an event together where we talked about colonialism and racism. And I became more and more involved in the Free West Papua campaign. I organized, together with youth political parties in the Netherlands, a manifest to show our solidarity with the Papuans. I joined some demonstrations with the Free West Papua campaign and Extinction Rebellion. And I also addressed at a course in Wageningen about anthropology and development that we are missing important perspectives. And Raki got a lecture where he could speak about the indigenous perspective. And I was also reading more and more books to educate myself, what I didn't learn during my master's. And Klaas from Studium Generale, he also asked me to help with setting up the decolonizing knowledge series of Studium Generale here at the TU Delft. And I also followed the Decolonial summer school. And all those things I wanted to bring back into my master with my thesis. And so what I did, for my case study, I focused on the Raki Ap region in West Papua, which is the most biodiverse coral reef region in the world. And as you can see, it's beautiful over there, because coral reefs are also highly threatened with climate change. Already around a decade, with 1.5 degrees, coral reefs will be almost non-existent. So what's the answer for that? You see more and more countries and continents are coming up with green deals, such as the European Green Deal, where Europe is striving to be the first climate neutral continent in 2050. And there are 3 main goals for the European Union: is to have no net emissions of greenhouse gases, to have an economic growth decoupled from resource use, and to have no person and no place left behind, with its just transition mechanism. And one of the solutions for that is to have a green, renewable, and clean energy transition. However, research also have shown that renewable energy production will exacerbate mining threats to biodiversity. And that's also what is happening in the Raki Ap. Here you see pictures of 2 islands where nickel mining companies are located and also got their licenses at the moment to extract nickel. And to give briefly an overview about the nickel markets, nickel is one of the metals that will have the strongest acceleration in demand growth. It can have a rise of 99% in demand in 2050. And herein, the European nickel demand will be between 23 to 50% in 2050. And if you look into the role of Indonesia, Indonesia is the largest nickel producer and has the most nickel reserves in the world. And that also means that nickel mining is highly exposed to biodiversity risks. So Indonesia is seen as one of the leading countries for the production of nickel for renewable energy technologies. And now I'm talking again about biodiversity, but actually, and that's what Raki already showed, it's about indigenous people's lives, because they are the defenders of those worldwide biodiversity. And more reports and research are also coming up where they say that we have to protect indigenous people's rights or the Paris climate goals will fail. And if you take the viewpoint that colonialism has caused climate change and is an ongoing driver of the climate crisis, it's not becoming as a surprise anymore. And it's not just me that took this viewpoint for my research, it's also recognized by the last IPCC reports. And if you look then what's happening in the Raki Ap region and in West Papua, children are slaughtered as indigenous people of Papua are driven out of their jungle homes. And also the UN mentioned that there are shocking abuses against indigenous Papuans. And what the UN also mentioned is that these cases are just the tip of the iceberg, given that access in the region is restricted. And that's also one of my reasons that I decided to do my research in the Netherlands, and I didn't go to West Papua for safety reasons for me, but also for the Papuans over there. So my research aim was to give context to the historical backgrounds, to understand the present colonial injustices. And I also looked at some future prospects, which allows for more understanding of the rising threat of nickel mining for indigenous Papuans and their environments. And this is necessary for understanding how to go beyond reproducing historical and current inequalities of colonialism. So when I was doing my research, I was using a framework, a decolonizing ecology, as a method, where I also put next to all the theories that I was reading, also to put it in practice. So a decolonial view is that I did research from the perspectives of the colonized, and I write down stories of the oppressed groups. And so I did a lot of interviews for my research, but I also did some other things. For example, a Dutch Papuan organization interviewed me so I could share my knowledge about my research, but also my solidarity. I wrote an opinion article together with Julia Yao and Raki Ap, to go against an article that was published in the Trouw, which had a really colonial framing of the Papuans. I also sent some of my research results to the embassy of the North Sea so they could use it. And I gave a lecture together with Raki about green colonialism at the Sustainable Critical Materials Seminar at the TU Delft. But I also did other things. I also emailed a journalist from the Correspondent that they really had an interview with Raki to show another perspective on climate change and the biodiversity crisis. I also joined demonstrations. Here you see a picture of where I joined the anti-racism and decolonial bloc at the climate march. And I also joined a dinner with the Free West Papua campaign, where I also met the leader of the Free West Papua campaign, Benny Wenda. And I drank a lot of coffee with Raki to share my research during my research results I already had. And this made me doing my research in 3 timelines. First, I looked at the Dutch colonial period, then I looked at the Indonesian colonial period, and I looked at the European Union. And what I did, I showed the big historical events from the Papuan history and the Papuan perspective, which is relevant to address colonial injustices. And I also dived into my case study, the Raki Ap, to see how these colonial injustices are also occurring in the Raki Ap region. And to give you some examples, what I did, if you look into the past, as Raki already mentioned, the roots of the TU Delft appears to be in the Dutch East Indies and also so in the Netherlands, New Guinea. And so I dived into the historical archives of the TU Delft, where I found a report where Dutch geologists discovered nickel ores in 1956 in the Raki Ap. And I also read a book where I saw that during the time of transfer in 1961, plans were made for large-scale exploitation for nickel mining. So the Dutch government established the Pacific Nickel Mining Company and gave a license to operate for 75 years. And if you look at the present, one of the things I did was looking at Global Forest Watch to see some satellite pictures. And I saw on the island, Gag Island, that when the license was given in 2018, until 2022, deforestation already occurred on a large scale, and it will just be coming more and more for the coming until 2047. And I also watched a documentary where indigenous communities were interviewed and already mentioned the impacts they are feeling and the concerns they have for the future. And then, to give some examples about the future, what I did, I looked at a lot of reports about the European Union, about the energy transition, about the nickel market in Indonesia, where I saw that Europe is demanding a lot of nickel now and in the future. And what is defined by the European Union as green is a whole different view than what the Papuans are defining as green. Because previous year, the United Liberation Movement of West Papua launched the Green State Vision, where they show an alternative vision of what is seen as green by them. And so that brings me to the conclusion of my thesis research. How is nickel mining in West Papua related to colonial injustices? So what you see is that nickel mining is related to colonization of lands of indigenous communities in the history until now, today. And the indigenous Papuans have a long struggle for the right of self-determination, where the nickel mining is built on those colonial and racist structures. So what you see with nickel mining is that it's benefiting both from exploitation colonialism and settler colonialism. And with the growing demand of nickel, the Indonesian government, but also the European Union, can legitimize colonialism for the greening of our energy transitions, where there is no right of self-determination by the unfinished decolonization, there's no freedom of culture and identity expression, and there's an ongoing traumatization for indigenous Papuans. And so new stories in the energy transitions plans are needed, where we are striving for an inclusive justice. And for this just energy transitions, the right of indigenous Papuans must be respected, because only in this way we can have decolonial just solutions which preserves the most biodiverse coral reef region in the world. And my thesis research has been graded with an 8.5, which also shows that doing this kind of research can be done at TU Delft. And so one of the last things I want to share is what have I learned by doing this decolonial research at the Technical University. What is important to know is that the TU Delft has colonial roots, because it was once built to function as a settler colonial entity. People need to understand this extractive nature of research that most scientists is practicing. And herein, indigenous peoples are systematically excluded and their knowledge is invalidated because of the origins of the Western science. And when I was addressing these issues and raising awareness during my study, it often led to conflicting conversations. But I also saw that I need to have, without painful and uncomfortable conversations, I couldn't be in the process of decolonizing my mind and decolonizing my research. And the other thing is, what I want to mention, is that we must view the ecological crisis from a justice perspective and focus on the lived experience of marginalized people. And so I use my position in research to strengthen these oppressed perspectives. And thereby I saw that research is not something I did by myself, but it's a collective project where what you really need is also supervisors who believe in you, who believed in me, and also validated my experience I had as a student during my master and were open to learn as well. And so I put my theory also into practice, what I already showed with my examples, and you also need to put your practice back into theory. And now I'm working as an activist freelancer to still share my knowledge and also to put it into articles. And I also got the opportunity as a youth representative of the Free West Papua campaign, together with Julia Jouwe, to have a political lobby training on the right of self-determination in Straatsburg. And Raki is also using my thesis research for his political lobby, as he gave the Green State Vision and my thesis research to the Dutch Minister of Climate Affairs. And that's why I want to end with the following, is that I hope one day the master study industrial ecology is not talking anymore about the industrial part, but has a decolonial ecology, which is more innovative by nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Linn and Raki. Now there is time for questions and answers. So I think that provocative and insightful conversation here. Yeah, someone has a question for our speakers? If no, I can ask. I know it. Here's one.
My question was that at one point you said that green is viewed as very different in a very different perspective in Papua than it is here, but what is specifically different from that lens?
Yeah, that's better.
You can keep the...
I mentioned it, or Anne-Linn?
I mentioned it.
Let me give a start, and then she can pick it over from there. I think what she's meaning, that from the indigenous people's point of view, green means keeping the land as it is without exploiting it for minerals, for the batteries. While here, green is, reducing plastic, eating less meat, having a, electric car, windmills, and I think that's an immense difference of green. Wow, because that green is destroying the real green in the world. Please, perhaps that's my explanation, but perhaps you can add or.
Yeah. What I saw is that what we as in with the European Green Deal are labeling as green is mainly the electric cars, the windmills, the solar panels. And if you look at the mining that's needed for that, and that is most of the time on indigenous lands, for them it's not green, but it's actually like a threat to their lives, and it's more about a genocide and ecocide. So that's a whole different, it's the opposite of what is green. So that's what I want to add.
Yeah, you have a follow-up question, or no?
Thank you.
Filippo, I saw you, but you need to go for the film. For the film.
So thank you both for very interesting presentations. And I have a question actually for Anne-Linn, because I'm quite interested in the research part. And I was just curious, as a researcher myself here at TU Delft, how difficult it was for you to get the topic of your thesis accepted and to find a professor who would support you, and if you have any general suggestions for us researchers how to make sure that these topics are more present in the PhD thesis or master thesis or whatever. So from the side of TU Delft, yeah, thank you.
It was quite a challenge in the beginning, because what I really missed during my master studies is that a lot of teachers I had didn't address these issues. I'm not talking about this when we were talking about the energy transition. It was more like, oh yeah, there is also mining needed and it has some negative effects. But it was more like a side story. And luckily, I got in the beginning already one of my supervisors, Udo Pesch, and he was from the beginning on really like open to me. Like, I don't know a lot about colonialism, about West Papua, or all those topics you're raising, but I'm open to learn from you as well. And that really helped me as a student. It was also looking a way to do this research. So I was like, okay, there's someone that believes in to have another kind of thesis research. But it took me a long time to find a second supervisor, because I had with some of the teachers that will be maybe my second supervisor, I have more like conflicting conversations. And but it didn't stop me, that I was like, I still have to do this research because I still had Udo. But I can imagine for other students, it can be really hard to still believe you have to do this research, because it cost me like months first before I found a second supervisor. And also those conflicting conversations can be quite overwhelming. But I do see, like a few weeks ago, Raki was giving a other workshop about indigenous perspectives on climate change here at the TU Delft. And I met a lot of students also from industrial ecology that really want to learn more about this perspective, and also want to do research about indigenous perspectives and climate and on climate change and what I was doing. So I think there are already a lot of students that want to do this, but there need to be more teachers that are open to learn as well. So, yeah.
There is one question, then I come in here, and then I think, yeah, it's for the record. It's not for.
So my question is actually, it's not directly to your presentations, but I'm a recent graduate from TU Delft. I'm an alumni, so I also I'm from the architecture and planning faculty, and I studied urbanism. So my research was about actually reimagining smart cities. And it is also, upon my research, I understood that it's a very colonial, a Western concept, I would like to say. So I was in my research also, I was trying to find out that how do you define this informal planning. And basically in the global south, we kind of either romanticize informal planning or really look down upon informal planning. Fortunately, I had mentors who was both a Dutch and another mentor who was from the global south. So I had a balance that I achieved. But my question would be how to decolonize a country's beliefs and planning systems when you come from a global south country. I know there's no right answer.
Me starting?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. But difficult to answer. And as you mentioned, there is not one answer. But I think that it starts with the stories we share from when you're a kid. To give you a clear example, of course, over the years, we have normalized some perspective and downsized those of others. Like those, we are subhuman, we are superior. This is science. And that is just, it's not scientist-based. So With having this said, I think it is important that we try to reflect on the numbers that we've just expressed. We are destroying lives, terrorizing all life on Earth. So it's about new norms and values, if you ask me. If you ask every indigenous citizen in a village, or in a village I should say, the parent, when their kid will learn them that what you take would be just that piece that you need to survive for this day or this week or this month. That you should take care of your villagers in the same way that you should be treated. That you just take, you balance everything you take from the nature so that it can restore. And it are these values that we miss from grade 1 up to university. And if you miss this kind of norms and values, the connection between humans and nature, you know, what do you give back to the people and the environment you deserve? You should serve, because that's our life we have. So what I wanted to say here is that we must try to rewrite our way of thinking and put that in our education. So the output will be other kind of human, other kind of student, other kind of teacher, other kind of technicians who take care and make policies and plans protecting life, fellow humans, and planet. Because the thing that you ask children now when they are graduated is, I want to be the CEO of that company, I want to be a football player. Few of them would say, I would take care of my environment, about the rivers, the mountains. And this is just a simple explanation about what do we care and what is knowledge. So the sooner we do this from a baby on, up to graduated, up to practitioners in whatever institution, I can promise you, tomorrow we'll make a new society, because new humans with the similar mindset as indigenous peoples will build the cities we need in balance. I hope there are some answers in there.
Yeah.
Oh, you got that.
Yeah, I can add on that with my experience for my research and my master's. It also has to do with the viewpoint you're taking of making solutions. And what I saw during my master is that the viewpoint was a lot of time that with the industrialization period in history, there was a CO2 rise, and we need to do something about the CO2 rise. And then you're making, if you look on that, you're making whole different solutions for sustainable development, as they call it, then if you will take the viewpoint of colonialism as cause climate change, that's a whole different story. And that's the story that wasn't told during my master's. So I think that also has to do with stories, like for what are you making those solutions? And who is defining that?
And just to add something more is...
Wait, microphone.
Yeah. Sorry for that. I think it's important because yet the thing I asked cost immense time. So what we both highlight is that, you know, we built the system with the stories and knowledge that we gathered over the years. So we need new stories so we can at least start to reverse our policy making, our thinking. So, and that's where we try to, you know, influence people by just planting seeds about new way of thinking and acting as student, as activist, or whatever practitioner.
Okay, thank you. We have until more or less 7 minutes for the remaining questions. Anyways, we will have some time for also breakout groups where you can go deeper to these questions.
Thank you so much for very fascinating talks. My question is about the role of diversity in planning and in ecology. And, you know, we're talking about indigenous as something that is somehow, say, opposed to developmentalism. But then there are so many different types of indigenousness. I would like to know what your kind of views are on this, because we talk about diversity, we talk about so many different perspectives, but then after that, we end up with this weird homogeneity where nothing really goes.
Interesting.
Start?
You want to start? Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. Also a very good question, and I think let me try to answer this one. But I think, yes, of course, this is just one perspective which I've called indigenous perspective, because it's very much related to my own story, but also to numbers that have been shown by the UN and scientists about the role of indigenous people. What is indigenous peoples? You could, there's a definition, UN definition about that, but it doesn't clarify it. It's basically said, people who live in very balance with their environment. So if you talk about, diversity and what is the best way to, to have the best outcome, I really don't know what the outcome will be. What I do think, because we act at, is that when you bring perspective that have shown and are science-based, resulting in preserving Earth's ecosystem, the way we care about lives, the outcome would be much more positive. So diversity can also be something negative, let me say it that way, because if you said, but it should be diverse, we should also have perspective from the corporations, it's also a negative impact on social justice, on environment. So it depends on what diversity. I won't include, those who still have racist perspective or creates social or environmental injustice. So this is the critical part that you should be aware when you talk about diversity. And it's in thinking and policy making in space. Yes, if you ask me, I would disclose them because they're creating harm to people in the decision making, in the thinking. And I think this is what I want to share, at least. Hope that there are some answers in there. Is there something you want to?
Yeah, I can also add a little bit on it. Before my master in industrial ecology, I studied international development studies at the University of Wageningen. And what I learned about indigenous peoples was something that's far away and that's a little bit like an exotic image. And that's also with anthropology. You have to study those indigenous peoples. But then when I read the story of Raki and when I was meeting Raki and then I became more and more involved, I saw like indigenous peoples are not far away. They're also here in the Netherlands and they are striving every day to show their perspective and to strive for more justice. And that's also the link what Raki was also mentioning about the green NGOs. When they are talking about the biodiversity crisis, and also with my master's study, when we are talking about the biodiversity crisis, where are those indigenous speakers? Because there are so many here in the Netherlands, and there's also a decolonial a group, Foundation RLS, who also has a lot of speakers, but that's also the diversity part that's missing on those institutions. So that's my experience.
Thank you. So a footnote for those who are the sticker profession, very interesting point that Raki has brought. We can also discuss that in the breaking groups about the role of the private sector and corporations. So let me put it here, another question.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for making the presentation and solidarity to the people of West Papua. And I hope that the struggle, succeeds. Thank you, brother, for coming here. And I have a question for you, because if colonialism and capitalism is about erasure of all other forms of knowing, in your activism, how are you kind of nurturing the knowledge of the ancestors for the generations to come? What kind of work is happening around that? I would be very interested to know that, to kind of serve for those knowledge traditions to survive. And I had a question for you, Anne-Linn. First of all, great to see the allyship. Decolonialization is all about allyship, and it's good to see you two coming together like this. When you talked about practicing decolonial research, the methodologies you talked about, how would you say they're different from, let's say, a participatory research methodology? I just wanted to understand that, yeah.
Maybe you can start. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think what I can answer about that is that I used decolonial theories to research colonial injustices. And maybe I can go back to the framework, because that can at least helps me. Yeah, let me go back. I think yes. So what is important is that for me it was also new, and it was also new on my master studies to do decoloniality in praxis. And I used the framework of a decolonizing ecology because I wanted to address that. I want to use this framework to not have an industrial ecology perspective, but more like a decolonial ecology perspective. So I showed some examples of how I was decolonizing my mind, and that's an ongoing process. It's not like that there are some checks like, okay, now I know about how to decolonize my mind, and that will be an ongoing process. And also by Know Your Histories, I dived into the history of West Papua, and that's something I didn't learn during my schools and also not in my whole life. And I listened to the Papuans, what they wanted to have in the timeline as important historical events. And decolonize access, what they did for that is also during my research, giving my research results to the indigenous Papuans and to have conversations with them. And also they were reading through my research if they were missing perspectives. And yeah, I can go on with that. And you can also see it as like that I was as a participant in the Free West Papua movement and in the Papuan community. And but the most important thing is that I really practice to get in touch with them through my whole thesis to really check, is the Papuan perspective represented, and do you agree with my conclusion? Because the conclusion is not just that's me that's concluding about the colonial injustice, but it's about all my interviews I did and with the people I was meeting through my research. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Anne-Linn, and thank you for solidarity and this amazing question. Yes, so it's a constant struggle against the system for us, at least try to stay alive in the first place. So how do we, you know, get that knowledge in the first place is a challenge for me who grew up here in the Netherlands. I am lucky because my father was an anthropologist, and he was assassinated because he, as anthropologist and musician, the Bob Marley of West Papua, he became so famous that he becomes a threat. But the thing he have captured in the music is us West Papuans to embrace our culture, our way of living, because that is what makes us West Papuan. Having that said, you have to understand that indigenous people's knowledge are not kept as we know here in archives, in books. It's oral. It goes from elder to the younger generation and so on. And that's how it's lived for thousands of years. So I gather my knowledge with interviews and hearings of my uncles and grandpas, and to make sure that I understand it at least from multiple perspectives. And we have connections, of course, with academics now in West Papua who go to the villages and ask about what should be noticed in the Green State Vision. It's not ours. This is grabbed from our elders, saying how they think about, you know, the island. They've managed to keep that way for thousands of years. It's not our knowledge. We just grab it and put it in language that we have learned here. That's the difference. So it's about a way of thinking and learning, and these are different worlds. And try to put it on paper in stories. That's how we collected knowledge and share it through storytelling. And we are still here. We're resilient and live and kicking. And making sure that we educate each other, empower each other, and use the system to reverse it in a way that it can serve people and planet. Thank you. I'm going to leave it there.